Before we begin, take a breath and let the modern world fade. Imagine Louisiana in 1853, humid air, fields of sugarcane, and a silence heavy with power. In that silence lived a man they called Benjamin, a massive enslaved worker whose laughter could shake the veranda walls. To the other slaves, it was hope. To the master, it was rebellion. They said Benjamin's laugh was the only sound on the plantation that didn't ask for permission. And when the day came that laughter reached the ears of Colonel Creighton, something inside the master broke. Fear had found its way into the house that once ruled with fire and chains. So, if you're listening now, subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories they tried to bury, deserve to live again. Tonight, we return to Cypress Hollow, where one man's laughter became legend. This is the story of the fat slave who made his master tremble. On the banks of the Red River, where the cypress trees leaned so far over the water their branches touched their own reflections, stood Cypress Hollow Plantation. It was less a home than an empire carved out of swamp and sorrow. The fields stretched beyond the horizon, a patchwork of green and gold that shimmered beneath the Louisiana sun. At the center rose the Creighton House, a two-story monument of white columns and deception, where civility wore the face of kindness but spoke in the voice of command. Colonel Bartholomew Creighton ruled Cypress Hollow the way a priest rules a church through ritual, fear, and the illusion of divine order. To visitors, he was the image of Southern gentility, silver-haired and soft-spoken, a man who could quote scripture as easily as he could sign a bill of sale. Yet beneath that calm exterior lived a restlessness that demanded control. Every inch of the plantation was an extension of his will. The bells that rang at dawn, the overseer's horn at dusk, even the sound of the river at night seemed to obey him. The land itself appeared loyal, though it hated the men who worked it. The air was thick with cane dust and sweat. Every breath carried the smell of iron and molasses. In the quarters, men and women rose before sunrise, their backs bent and hands calloused, moving with the precision of people who had long ago learned that hesitation invited pain. The sugar house never slept. Its fires glowed red through the night, smoke curling toward a sky that refused to rain. Life at Cypress Hollow was built upon the delicate balance between silence and survival. The overseer, Merrick Tolliver, maintained order with the same ease Creighton maintained appearances. He was a man of small mind and large cruelty, a perfect instrument for a master who preferred not to dirty his own hands. Under his watch, the rhythm of the plantation became mechanical: cut, load, haul, burn, repeat, until even the sound of laughter felt like an act of rebellion. Yet beneath that surface of control, something stirred. The enslaved people of Cypress Hollow had begun to whisper in the dark. They spoke of omens in the sky, of a river that would one day rise high enough to wash the fields clean. They spoke of a man whose laughter could shatter chains. The colonel did not yet know his name, but he would soon. For the first time in his life, Bartholomew Creighton would learn that there are things in this world no master can own, not the land, not the wind, and not the soul of a man who refuses to kneel. They called him Ben the Ox, and the name was meant as both insult and warning. He was enormous, shoulders like a barn door, hands that could crush sugarcane in a single grip. His skin shone like oiled mahogany beneath the sun, and his movements carried the unhurried grace of someone who understood that speed was for those trying to prove something. Benjamin had nothing to prove. He worked the fields with the patience of a man who knew that time itself could be outlasted if one learned how to breathe through pain. Among the people in the quarters, Benjamin was more than muscle. He was the one who made others forget their hunger for a moment. He told stories in the evenings, voice rolling low like thunder across the bayou, and his laughter, deep, round, and alive, had a way of filling every dark corner. That laugh was dangerous. On a plantation built on silence, joy was an act of defiance. Every time Benjamin laughed, it carried across the rows, across the overseer's porch, up toward the main house where Colonel Creighton sipped his bourbon. It reminded the world that even in bondage, the soul could still make music. No one knew where Benjamin had come from. Some said he was born in Georgia. Others whispered about the riverboats in New Orleans where he once loaded barrels heavier than men. A few believed he had been sold half a dozen times before ending up at Cypress Hollow. What everyone agreed on was this: Benjamin did not break. Whips had found his back, chains had found his wrists, but neither had ever found his spirit. He did not raise his voice or his hand, yet his quiet steadiness unsettled those who needed fear to feel powerful. The overseer, Merrick Tolliver, pretended to mock him for his size but secretly hated the way the other men looked to Benjamin before obeying. It was as if he carried some invisible authority, a strength that came not from flesh but from knowing something the masters did not. In the evenings, when the work was done and the sky glowed red with the last of the sun, Benjamin would sit outside his cabin sharpening tools, humming a tune older than the river. He had seen too much, understood too much, and laughed anyway. In a world built to break men, Benjamin's laughter was prophecy. It was the sound of something waiting beneath the surface. Patient. Rising. Unstoppable. Soon enough, that laugh would reach ears it was never meant to reach, and Cypress Hollow would tremble. Isabel Creighton returned to Cypress Hollow on a day so hot that even the birds refused to sing. The river glimmered like a sheet of molten glass, and the house, with its grand columns and shaded veranda, seemed almost to recoil from the light. She had been gone 5 years, long enough for the world outside Louisiana to teach her that gentility could exist without cruelty. Charleston had softened her, refined her manners, and taught her the language of polite restraint. But no amount of finishing school charm could prepare her for the quiet horror of homecoming. Her mother's death had drawn her back, though part of her suspected her father's letter had been less about grief and more about image. The Creightons were masters of appearances. Even sorrow had to be performed. As Isabel stepped through the tall front doors, the air inside the house carried the faint smell of lavender and decay. Portraits of her ancestors lined the hallway, stern faces painted to look noble while the family wealth beneath their frames had been earned through other people's suffering. She moved past them quickly, unwilling to meet their gaze. To the enslaved people who saw her carriage arrive, she was both familiar and foreign. They remembered her as the quiet girl who once played beneath the magnolias, unaware of what the world cost. Now she carried herself like someone trained to hide her thoughts, though the eyes that followed her could sense the tremor beneath that calm. The quarters whispered her name that night, wondering whether the daughter's return would make the master more merciful or more cruel. Isabel walked through the estate as if through a dream. The fields were larger than she remembered, the faces older, the songs quieter. Everything felt smaller and heavier at once. The laughter that drifted faintly from the quarters at dusk startled her. It sounded alive in a place that was supposed to be still. It came from a deep voice that rolled through the air like thunder, strange yet comforting. For a fleeting moment she almost smiled before guilt pulled her back into herself. In her father's study that evening, she looked out the window toward the rows of cane and saw the faint orange glow of the sugar house fires. She realized then that Cypress Hollow was not the grand estate the world believed it to be. It was a machine powered by silence. And as the night deepened, Isabel understood that she had returned not as a daughter, but as a witness to the slow unraveling of everything her family had built. The night settled over Cypress Hollow like a heavy curtain, thick with the smell of cane smoke and the hum of insects rising from the riverbanks. The day's heat lingered in the soil, radiating upward in slow waves that blurred the line between earth and air. Inside the main house, all was still except for the faint clink of crystal against wood. Colonel Bartholomew Creighton sat alone on the veranda, bourbon glass in hand, staring across the fields that had made him a wealthy man and an empty one. He had spent his life mastering silence. Every sound that reached his ears, the crack of a whip, the creak of wagon wheels, the endless scrape of blades cutting cane, was music to a man who equated noise with productivity. But that night, the rhythm broke. From somewhere deep in the darkness beyond the tree line came a sound that did not belong to Cypress Hollow. It was laughter, low, full, alive. It rolled through the air with a confidence that defied the stillness. At first, Creighton thought it must be one of the field hands drunk on stolen liquor, foolish enough to forget his place. Yet the sound carried too much strength, too much joy. It was not the nervous laughter of a man afraid of being caught. It was the laughter of someone who knew fear could no longer touch him. The colonel's hand trembled, bourbon rippling in the glass. He told himself it was the heat, the bourbon, age perhaps, but he knew better. Something in that laugh unsettled him. The night swallowed the sound as quickly as it had come, but the echo lingered. He sat frozen, listening, waiting for it to return. The plantation had never sounded so vast, nor he so small within it. In that fleeting moment, Bartholomew Creighton realized that for all his wealth and authority, he did not own the silence of this land as completely as he believed. Somewhere out there was a man who could still find laughter in bondage, and that thought chilled him more than any northern wind. In the quarters, the laughter died down to murmurs and whispers, but its pulse remained in the air, carried by those who heard it. They said the master had paused his drink, that his hand had shaken, that the sound of freedom had passed through Cypress Hollow and left its mark. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone felt the shift. Power had cracked just a hairline fracture in the night, but enough for the moon to see through. Morning came heavy and gray, the kind of sky that promised no mercy. The air hung damp and sour over Cypress Hollow, pressing against the lungs of every man and woman who rose before sunrise. The fields were still wet from the night's dew, the ground soft beneath bare feet. By the time the horn sounded, the entire plantation already knew what was coming. A punishment had been ordered. The reason hardly mattered. At Cypress Hollow, reason was not required, only obedience. Benjamin was taken from his cabin before the first bell. Merrick Tolliver, the overseer, had woken him with the butt of his rifle and a voice that dripped with satisfaction. Word had spread that the colonel himself would attend, and that was enough to make the morning slower, quieter, more dangerous. The workers gathered near the old whipping post, their faces carved from the same mixture of fear and resignation that had become their daily disguise. Tolliver strutted before them like a rooster before dawn, proud to serve as the master's hand. Colonel Creighton appeared soon after, dressed as though he were attending church rather than spectacle. His white gloves were spotless. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and even a tone more terrifying than any shout. He spoke of order, of discipline, of the need for silence among those who labored under God's command. Then he gave the order 20 lashes, until silence learns its lesson. Tolliver smiled, and the whip cracked like lightning through still air. The first strike opened Benjamin's back. The second drew blood. By the third, the ground was dotted with red, and still Benjamin made no sound. His jaw set firm, eyes forward, his body swayed but did not fall. With each lash his silence grew heavier, louder than any cry could have been. It filled the yard, a presence that made even the river seem to pause its flow. When the final lash fell, the overseer stepped back, panting from effort. The colonel's eyes met Benjamin's, and something unfamiliar flickered behind his composed stare. For a heartbeat he felt unsteady. The man before him should have been broken, begging, humiliated. Instead, he stood bleeding but unbowed, his silence a mirror that forced the colonel to see himself reflected in its calm. It was not defiance in Benjamin's gaze, it was understanding, the kind that made power tremble. The men were dismissed. The women carried water and cloths in quiet haste. Colonel Creighton turned away, but his hand would not stop shaking. Later, alone on the veranda, he told himself it was the bourbon again, the heat, the age. Yet deep within, he knew what it truly was, the first shiver of fear. By the next morning, the story had already taken on a life of its own. The quarters whispered it in low tones before dawn, as if speaking his name too loudly might call down punishment. A man who would not scream, they said, could not be ruled. The tale moved like wind through the sugar cane, reshaping itself with every telling until Benjamin became more myth than flesh. Some swore he had not felt the whip at all. Others claimed he had stared at the overseer until the man faltered. Every version carried the same truth, something at Cypress Hollow had shifted. The enslaved began to move differently that day, not boldly, not foolishly, but with a faint lift in their shoulders, as though the weight pressing down on them had lightened, if only by an ounce. The overseers noticed it too, and it unsettled them. Control depended on fear, and fear depended on proof that pain could always win. But Benjamin's silence had broken that chain. Colonel Creighton tried to dismiss it as superstition, the ignorant awe of simple minds, yet the thought gnawed at him. In the quiet hours, when the house slept and the frogs croaked along the riverbanks, he began to hear echoes of that silence. He told himself it was imagination, the residue of authority unsettled by spectacle. Still, the dreams came. In them, he stood in his bedroom, the candle flickering on the dresser, and saw Benjamin's figure in the doorway. Not defiant, not vengeful, just standing, calm, eyes unblinking, a faint smile curving his lips. Creighton would wake drenched in sweat, the air thick with the scent of candle smoke, though no candle had burned. By the end of the week, even the children in the quarters knew the story. They mimicked Benjamin's stillness in play, pretending to face invisible whips, their laughter sharp and nervous. The older men warned them to stop, but the power of the tale had already taken root. It was more than a story now, it was a warning to the masters and a promise to the enslaved. For Colonel Creighton, every noise in the night began to carry weight. A cough, a shuffle, a laugh from afar, all felt like omens. He found himself avoiding mirrors and the veranda where the fields met the sky. The man who had ruled through silence now feared the very sound of it. Somewhere in those fields, a presence he could not name had awakened, and though he would never admit it aloud, Bartholomew Creighton had begun to tremble. The night Isabel Creighton chose to walk to the quarters, the moon hung low over the Red River, soft and swollen like a secret that refused to stay hidden. The air was thick with the hum of crickets and the far-off crackle of the sugar-house fires that never slept. She moved quietly, her footsteps sinking into the damp earth, her heart beating louder than the cicadas. In her hands she carried a bundle of linen and a small jar of salve wrapped in cloth, the sort her mother once kept for fevered servants but never touched herself. It was, she told herself, an act of Christian mercy. Nothing more. She had spent days watching Benjamin from the safety of the veranda, pretending indifference as he returned to work. His back bore the marks of her father's order, but he carried himself as if pain were beneath notice. That composure disturbed her. It was not defiance exactly, nor submission. It was something entirely outside the language of power she had been raised to understand. When she asked the house servants how he fared, they hesitated before answering, their eyes measuring her intent. It was then she knew that compassion here was a dangerous form of curiosity. Inside the small shed that passed for his quarters, the air smelled of oil, sweat, and damp wood. The walls were rough-hewn, the floor scattered with straw. She left the linen beside the cot, meaning to turn back at once, but her eyes lingered on the blood-stained rags that had been used to dress his wounds. Something tightened in her chest. She thought of her mother's funeral, of her father's composure that day, of the way grief had been disguised as dignity. This man, this Benjamin, had been beaten to enforce that same illusion, and still he had laughed. When the wind shifted, she heard the quarters stirring beyond the trees, murmurs soft and rhythmic like prayer. She realized she had stepped into a world her family had spent generations pretending did not exist. Here, beneath the shadow of her father's empire, humanity survived in quiet defiance. The thought frightened her as much as it awakened her. That night, as she returned to the big house, the hem of her dress heavy with river dew, Isabel felt something uncoil within her. She had offered mercy to a man her father called property, yet it did not feel like charity. It felt like confession. In that moment, beneath the patient stars, she understood that the boundaries between virtue and rebellion had blurred. And somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, came the low sound of laughter, a sound she would remember long after sleep refused to come. The summer deepened until the air itself seemed to pulse with fever. The cane fields glowed beneath the relentless sun, and the smell of hot iron and molasses clung to every surface of Cypress Hollow. Merrick Tolliver, the overseer, felt it in his bones, the kind of tension that precedes a storm. He had seen plantations fall apart for less than what he sensed now. Something had shifted in the rhythm of the place. The slaves moved differently, slower perhaps, but with an undercurrent of purpose he could not name. And at the center of it, he believed, was Benjamin. Tolliver watched everything, and what he saw unsettled him. He noticed the linen bandages that appeared at the shed door, clean and fine, far too delicate to have come from the quarters. He noticed how Isabel Creighton lingered longer near the edges of the yard, her gaze wandering toward the fields, as if she were searching for something she could not admit to herself. Her presence there was always followed by whispers, the kind that die quickly when footsteps approach. One evening, after supper, Tolliver climbed the veranda steps to find Colonel Creighton in his usual seat, a glass of bourbon sweating in his hand. The overseer spoke plainly, without ceremony. He told the colonel that mercy, once shown, spreads like sickness. A single act of kindness could undo the fear that kept the fields moving. It was not anger in his voice, but something closer to warning, the tone of a man who had seen rebellion born from sympathy. Creighton waved him off with a cold smile and told him not to concern himself with the affairs of women. The colonel's pride was armor enough against suggestion, yet the words lingered long after Tolliver left. That night, when the house was quiet, Bartholomew Creighton found himself standing outside his daughter's room, listening. The sound of pages turning, the faint rustle of fabric, it should have been nothing. Yet he could not shake the image of her face when she spoke of compassion, or the way she had looked at the wounded man who refused to scream. He told himself it was protection, not suspicion, that made him watch her so closely. Cypress Hollow had begun to breathe differently. The overseer felt it in the quarters, the colonel felt it in the house, and somewhere in between them, Isabel's compassion flickered like a candle threatening to light the dark. Neither man understood it yet, but that small flame would soon be enough to burn the plantation from the inside out. It began with the wind. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of copper, and the air carried that dry, restless scent that comes before disaster. The sugarcane swayed in long, rippling waves, their leaves whispering against one another like warning voices. When the first plume of smoke appeared beyond the northern field, no one paid it much mind. Fires were common in the Louisiana heat, brief and cruel but usually harmless. Yet this one did not fade. Within minutes the smoke thickened, spreading across the horizon like a dark tide. And then the flames rose tall, bright, hungry. The alarm spread through Cypress Hollow like thunder. Bells clanged. Orders were shouted, and men came running from every direction with buckets, shovels, and blankets. The overseer's voice cut through the chaos, but it was Benjamin's that the others followed. He moved through the confusion with a steadiness that calmed panic. He formed a line from the river to the fields, shouting for rhythm as water passed from hand to hand. The fire hissed and spat, but still they fought, each face streaked with soot and sweat, each movement driven by instinct rather than obedience. Colonel Creighton arrived soon after, his fine clothes out of place among the heat and ash. The fire was moving fast, eating its way through acres of cane that represented not just a harvest, but the foundation of his wealth. He gave orders no one heard, his voice drowned by the roar of burning stalks. When part of the drying shed collapsed in a burst of sparks, he ran toward it without thought, determined to save what remained. But the structure was already giving way. The beam above him cracked with a sound like a gunshot. Benjamin saw it before anyone else. Without hesitation, he threw himself forward, seizing the colonel by the arm and dragging him clear as the beam came down. The two men fell hard into the dirt, the colonel coughing and gasping in the smoke. For a brief instant their eyes met, the master's face pale with shock, the slave's darkened with ash. Around them, the fire still raged, but in that single moment the balance between them shifted. When the flames were finally beaten down and the night turned quiet again, gratitude filled the colonel's chest, but it soured almost immediately. He could not bear the thought of owing his life to the man he had ordered whipped. The realization lodged in him like a splinter. A master who needed saving was no master at all. As he sat alone on the veranda later, nursing a trembling hand and a drink gone warm, Bartholomew Creighton felt something colder than fear settle inside him. Humiliation, and it would not leave him again. Sleep became an enemy to Colonel Bartholomew Creighton. Every time his eyes closed, the fire returned, the roar of it, the heat, the strange moment when he had felt a hand stronger than his own pull him back from death. He woke drenched in sweat, the sound of laughter echoing faintly in his mind. It was not cruel laughter, not mocking, but full and alive, like the laugh he had once heard drifting through the cane before everything began to unravel. Each night the echo grew louder until he could no longer tell whether it lived in his dreams or in the walls of the house itself. The days brought no peace. The plantation moved as always, but the rhythm was off. The workers still bent to the cane. Yet their silence felt heavier, deliberate. Merrick Tolliver assured him that order remained, but even Tolliver's voice trembled when he spoke. Creighton spent his mornings pacing the veranda, watching the men from afar, certain that when they turned their heads away, they were smiling at him. Gratitude had turned to unease, unease to paranoia. He told himself that Benjamin's act of rescue had been nothing more than obligation, a slave saving the hand that fed him. But the truth pressed harder each day he was alive, because of a man he had tried to break. By the second week, the colonel's composure had fractured. Servants whispered of him speaking aloud to ghosts, of bourbon bottles left half empty across the parlor, of sleepless nights and sudden outbursts. The man who had once ruled Cypress Hollow with quiet precision now moved through it like a restless shadow. Finally, one morning, he gave an order that silenced even Tolliver. Benjamin was to be confined in the storage barn until further notice. No reason was offered, none required. The overseer hesitated, but the colonel's eyes burned with such exhaustion that disobedience felt dangerous. That evening, the family gathered for supper. The long dining table gleamed beneath candlelight, every setting arranged with military perfection. When the colonel announced his decision, the room froze. Isabel's fork clattered against her plate. Her voice trembled as she demanded to know why. Her father's hand slammed against the table, the sound sharp as thunder. For a heartbeat, the house itself seemed to stop breathing. A daughter had raised her voice to her father. A Creighton had challenged his command. Afterward, the candles burned low, their smoke curling through the still air. The colonel sat alone, staring into the dark, his mind slipping further from reason. He could not name the fear that haunted him, only that it wore Benjamin's face and sounded like laughter echoing through smoke. In the quiet madness of that night, gratitude died, and obsession took its place. The rain had returned to Cypress Hollow, slow and deliberate, the kind that soaked the earth without washing anything clean. The plantation seemed to move under a gray shroud, its rhythm slowed, its people quieter. The cane fields glistened in the dull light, each stalk bowed beneath the weight of the storm. Inside the great house, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and bourbon. Colonel Bartholomew Creighton had become a ghost of himself, wandering from room to room with the distracted gaze of a man chasing something only he could see. His hands shook when he lifted his glass, and the servants learned to vanish before he noticed them. Isabel watched her father's decay in silence. The man who had once ruled every inch of Cypress Hollow with absolute certainty now muttered to himself and flinched at sudden sounds. At meals, he forgot words, stared at his plate for long stretches, and sometimes laughed at nothing at all. The doctor who came from Alexandria spoke of exhaustion, of nerves frayed by the heat, but Isabel knew better. Her father was not ill in the body. Something deeper had rotted inside him, the memory of being saved by the man he had tried to destroy. Late one afternoon, she sat at her writing desk beneath the window that overlooked the flooded yard. The storm blurred the horizon, turning the world outside to a wash of green and gray. She took up her pen and began to write. Her cousin Charlotte in Savannah was the only person she could speak to without fear of scandal. The letter began politely, as letters between ladies were expected to, but soon her words grew unsteady. She wrote of her father's strange behavior, of the sleepless nights filled with muttering and footsteps, of the fire that had changed everything. Then, almost without meaning to, she mentioned him, the man who refused to kneel. She described Benjamin not as a servant or property, but as someone entirely separate from the world her family had built. She wrote of his silence during the punishment, his composure in the fire, the look in his eyes that seemed to carry something ancient and unbroken. Her pen hesitated over the paper as she realized how her words might sound, but she did not stop. In a single, unguarded line, she confessed that she no longer knew which side of righteousness her own blood stood upon. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and pressed it flat beneath her hand, feeling her pulse against the paper. She could not send it, not yet. Mail passed through too many hands, and words once written were dangerous things. So she slid it into the pages of her mother's old hymnal, the one she kept on her bedside table. Between the psalms and the brittle flower petals her mother had once dried there, the letter disappeared. That night, the rain finally stopped. The house slept under its damp silence. Merrick Tolliver, restless and curious, crept through the hallway on his nightly inspection. The overseer had learned long ago that the secrets of the Creighton family were worth more than wages. Passing Isabel's open door, he noticed the hymnal on the table, half open, a folded sheet peeking from between its pages. He reached for it, meaning only to glance. But when he read the words about her father's ruin, about Benjamin, about compassion, he felt something stir, not guilt, opportunity. He folded the letter again, slipped it into his coat pocket, and left without a sound. Outside, the moon broke through the clouds for the first time in days, its reflection trembling across the flooded yard. In the distance, the cane fields whispered under the wind, carrying the weight of a secret that had just changed hands. Inside the house, Isabel slept beneath the illusion of safety, unaware that her words now belonged to a man who had never once known mercy. The storm came without warning. By nightfall, the sky had turned the color of ink, and the wind tore through Cypress Hollow with a voice that sounded like the earth itself had begun to scream. The rain did not fall, it attacked, slashing sideways, drumming against the roof with a force that made the house tremble. The river, swollen from weeks of unrelenting storms, rose inch by inch until its edges bled into the fields. By the time the first bell sounded, the levee was already straining against the weight of it. Merrick Tolliver was the first to see the water breach. From the stable he shouted orders, his voice swallowed by thunder. The men worked frantically, dragging ropes, moving animals, shoving boards against the rushing current, but the river had decided that night would belong to it. A sound like a rifle crack split the air as the levee gave way. Water surged through the cane in a wall of darkness, swallowing everything in its path. Tolliver ran toward the pens, shouting for the mules, and vanished beneath the torrent. By morning, only a single hat and a broken lantern were found tangled in the reeds. Inside the great house, Isabel stood at the window, watching the black water rise across the yard. The trees bent under the wind, their branches scraping against the shutters. Somewhere beyond the noise of rain and thunder came another sound, wood breaking, timbers groaning. She realized too late that the flood had reached the steps. The servants had fled to higher ground. The colonel was nowhere to be found, and only Benjamin remained within sight. He moved through the storm with the calm of a man who had seen worse things than weather. Together they fought to secure the shutters, to block the doors, to save what they could of a house built on vanity and cruelty. Lightning struck the magnolia outside, splitting it in two. For a single moment, the world turned white, as though heaven itself had opened its eyes. In that glare, Isabel saw Benjamin's face soaked, unflinching, the same calm that had defied the whip and the fire. It was not the face of a servant, it was the face of someone alive in the truest sense of the word. The storm roared around them, but something quieter passed between them then, something wordless and impossible to name. The water reached the veranda before it finally stopped climbing. They spent the rest of the night trapped in the parlor, listening to the creaks of the old house holding itself together. Every flash of lightning painted the walls in stark white, turning portraits into ghosts and shadows into confessions. By dawn, the rain had eased to a whisper. The fields were gone, replaced by a lake that shimmered in the weak light of morning. When the river finally began to retreat, Cypress Hollow lay half-drowned, its fences broken, its cane flattened into mud. Isabel stood barefoot in the wreckage, her gown heavy with water, and watched the sun struggle through the clouds. Benjamin stood beside her, silent, his hands scarred and raw. In that moment, there were no boundaries left between them. The house that had once defined their world had nearly been swept away, and the river had washed something else clean as well. When the light fell across their faces, they were no longer master and servant, only two souls who had survived the same night and would never again look at each other or themselves the same way. Morning came slow to Cypress Hollow, as if the sun itself hesitated to look upon what the night had left behind. The storm had passed, but it had not gone quietly. The fields lay flattened, stalks of sugarcane twisted and buried beneath silt. The once proud fences were splintered, the barns half collapsed, the quarters scattered with debris. Mud coated everything: the earth, the steps of the big house, even the leaves of the magnolias that now drooped under the weight of ruin. What had once been order and precision now looked like the aftermath of war. The people of the plantation moved through the wreckage in silence. They gathered what little could be salvaged: tools, food, and the bodies of those who had not survived the flood. Merrick Tolliver's name was whispered once, then never again. No one wept for him. The river had taken him the same way it had taken the fences and the cane, without judgment, without care. The survivors buried the dead in ground still wet from the storm and returned to their cabins with eyes that had seen too much. Inside the house, Colonel Bartholomew Creighton walked through the corridors like a man inspecting the remains of a kingdom he had once ruled. Every sound seemed louder now: the drip of water from the roof, the creak of the floors, the soft murmur of servants cleaning in hushed tones. His authority, once absolute, felt fragile. He sensed it in the way people looked at him too briefly or too long, in the way his daughter avoided his eyes, and in the way Benjamin carried himself as though something fundamental had shifted. Rumors had begun to spread before the mud had even dried. Some said the colonel had fled during the storm, leaving others to fend for themselves. Others claimed that the flood had been divine punishment, a reckoning for sins too long ignored. The story that spread fastest, however, was the one about the man who saved the master's life. It passed from mouth to mouth like a hymn, growing stronger with each telling. Benjamin's name became a kind of talisman, spoken quietly but with reverence. The colonel tried to silence it, to reassert control, but the plantation no longer listened. Every command felt like an echo of what he once was. He watched Benjamin return to the fields to help rebuild, watched the men follow his lead without hesitation, and felt something deep inside him twist. Gratitude had turned to humiliation, humiliation to paranoia. In Benjamin's calm, he saw a mirror of his own decay. The man's silence was unbearable, steady, unshaken, untouched by the fear that ruled everyone else. At night, Creighton sat by the window with a candle burning low, staring out over what remained of his empire. The land had survived, but his power had not. He imagined whispers in the wind, saw shapes moving among the trees that were not there. Every sound of laughter carried through the walls like a threat. The storm had washed away more than soil. It had stripped him of illusion. And somewhere beyond the ruined fields, a new kind of order was taking root, one that owed nothing to him. As dawn broke over the drowned earth, the smoke of smoldering brush fires drifted through the air, faint but persistent. Cypress Hollow smelled of ash and wet cane, the scent of something ending and something else beginning. And in that silence, where power once spoke, Benjamin's quiet presence was louder than thunder. It began as a small thing, a flicker so faint that Colonel Bartholomew Creighton thought it nothing more than fatigue. His right hand twitched as he lifted his morning cup of coffee, a small tremor that passed as quickly as it came. But by the end of the week, it had become something else, persistent, rhythmic, beyond control. At first he blamed the sleepless nights, then the bourbon, then the fevered air that hung heavy over the ruins of Cypress Hollow. Yet no excuse could hide what every mirror reminded him of. The hand that once signed orders, struck bargains, and held the plantation in check had begun to betray him. He took to wearing gloves, pale leather ones that concealed the movement, but the tremor spread until even the fabric could not hide it. His pen scratched unevenly across paper, the ink blotting his signature into unreadable stains. Servants noticed. They pretended not to, but silence on a plantation had a language of its own. Every glance held questions that dared not be spoken. The master was weakening. The man whose word had once carried the weight of law now spilled his brandy with every twitch. Creighton's temper followed the rhythm of his hand. He barked orders, then forgot them. He called for work to be redone that had already been finished. His voice cracked in the middle of sentences. The more he tried to maintain control, the more he felt it slipping through his fingers. He began to isolate himself, taking meals alone in his study. The shutters drawn even in daylight. The trembling grew worse when he thought of Benjamin, whose name he could barely stand to hear. It was that name, that face, that seemed to live in the movement of his hand, as if his body itself remembered the touch of the man who had once dragged him from the fire. In the quarters, the whispers grew bolder. They said the master's hand shook because the devil had touched him, that the river spirits had claimed part of his soul for the life that was stolen from them. Some claimed Benjamin's silence had cursed him, that the strength of one man's endurance had turned against its maker. The overseers dismissed it as foolish talk, but even they had begun to exchange uneasy looks. The plantation had lived too long under fear to mistake the scent of weakness when it came. At night, Creighton sat alone in the parlor, the glass trembling in his grip, candlelight dancing across the sheen of sweat on his brow. The ticking of the clock seemed to mock him, steady where he was not. Once, he had ruled this place with nothing more than a glance. Now his eyes betrayed fatigue, his voice betrayed doubt, and his hands, those instruments of command, betrayed everything. The tremor became his secret companion. It met him in the mornings, followed him through the halls, and waited beside his bed when he tried to sleep. Each shiver of his fingers was a whisper of his own undoing. The river had not drowned him, but it had left its mark. And though the house still bore his name, Cypress Hollow no longer belonged to Bartholomew Creighton. It belonged to the silence that mocked his trembling hands. By the time autumn settled over the Red River Valley, Colonel Bartholomew Creighton had convinced himself that salvation could be bought with distance. The tremor in his right hand had worsened, spreading up his arm like a secret infection, and no amount of bourbon or prayer could steady it. He had taken to wearing darker gloves now, heavy and tight, the kind meant more for concealment than comfort. But the hand was not the only thing beyond his control. Every day Benjamin moved through the yard with quiet purpose, repairing fences, rebuilding sheds, teaching the younger men how to brace the new levee walls. His calm presence radiated through the quarters like heat from an ember. Creighton saw it, and the sight hollowed him out. The man who had once been whipped, beaten, confined, now walked the plantation grounds with the air of someone who feared nothing. That calm was unbearable. It had to be removed. In the stillness of his study, beneath the dim flicker of an oil lamp, Creighton drafted the papers himself. The handwriting was unsteady, jagged, betraying the tremor he tried so desperately to hide. The document was simple, a bill of sale transferring ownership of Benjamin to a refinery in Iberville Parish. It was an efficient place, he was told, where the work was harder, the discipline absolute, and no man lasted more than a few years. It was the perfect exile for a slave who had become too visible. Once Benjamin was gone, the colonel told himself, order would return. The whispers would die, the laughter would fade, and his own reflection might once again resemble the man he had been. He sealed the papers in a wooden box, intending to deliver them to the broker at dawn. Yet the weight of the decision hung thick in the air, pressing down on the house like humidity before rain. Isabel sensed it before she knew it. She had grown attuned to her father's moods, reading the tension in the way he avoided her eyes, the way he gripped the railing when he walked. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered into his study. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving only the faint glow of embers. The desk stood open, and there, among the scattered correspondence and unpaid bills, she found the sealed documents. Her hands shook as she broke the wax and read. The words were clinical, stripped of humanity, but the name leapt from the page all the same. Benjamin. She read it twice, the reality settling into her chest like a stone sinking through water. Her father meant to sell him not for profit, but for pride. The man who had saved his life was being cast away for daring to exist as proof of his weakness. For a long time, Isabel stood in the dark, the paper trembling in her grip. Every lesson of obedience, every rule of decorum that her upbringing had carved into her began to crack. She thought of Benjamin's silence during the whipping, his voice in the storm, the moment when the world had flooded, and he had stood beside her without fear. To lose him now would be to lose the only truth left in Cypress Hollow. When she replaced the papers, her decision was already made. She would stop the sale, whatever the cost. It would mean defying her father, her family name, and the laws that bound their world together, but something inside her had already shifted beyond the reach of those things. Outside, the night was quiet except for the hum of frogs along the riverbank. Somewhere in the quarters, a faint sound of laughter drifted through the dark, a sound that once terrified her father, but now felt like a promise. The dawn that followed the discovery of the auction papers broke too quietly, as if the land itself sensed the change that was about to come. A heavy mist hung over the river, wrapping Cypress Hollow in a gray stillness that concealed more than it revealed. Before the bell rang, before the overseers had even stirred, Benjamin was gone. The men in the quarters awoke to find his cabin empty, the cot neatly made, the few possessions he owned: an old tin cup, a worn Bible without a cover left behind. There was no note, no sign of struggle, only footprints leading toward the levee, disappearing into the reeds where the river whispered to itself. By mid-morning the news reached the house. Colonel Creighton's fury shook the walls, his voice carried through the corridors like thunder rolling across open fields. Orders were shouted, men dispatched on horseback, hounds brought from the kennels. The colonel's hand trembled as he gripped the railing, his face pale with a rage that bordered on fear. He called it theft, insubordination, betrayal, but beneath the words was something quieter, something he could not name. The man who had haunted his dreams had vanished, and it felt less like escape than judgment. Isabel heard the commotion from her room and knew before anyone told her. She had hidden the auction papers beneath the floorboard the night before, but it no longer mattered. Benjamin had not waited to be sold or saved. He had taken his freedom with his own hands. Still, the thought of him alone on the road, hunted and outnumbered, twisted her chest with a fear that refused to fade. Before reason could stop her, she gathered her cloak, mounted her horse, and rode toward the river. The road south was little more than a narrow path carved through cane and mud, following the slow bends of the Red River toward Lafayette. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and every sound, the rustle of birds, the splash of distant water, felt amplified against her heartbeat. She found him before dusk, walking beside the road with his boots in his hand, his clothes still wet from the crossing. When he saw her, there was no surprise, only understanding. The silence between them said everything words could not. They traveled together through the night, keeping close to the trees, avoiding the main crossings where patrols waited. Lanterns flickered along the distant levees, ghostly lights searching the water for movement. Somewhere behind them, dogs barked, faint but growing nearer. Every hoofbeat of Isabel's horse felt borrowed from fate, each one a promise that could be broken at any moment. The world around them narrowed to breath and shadow, to the sound of wind in the cane and the rhythm of flight. By the second day, rumor had already spread along the river road: a slave escaped from Cypress Hollow, the master's daughter seen riding in the same direction. The story grew with every telling. Some said she had been kidnapped, others claimed she had fallen in love. Each version carried the same undercurrent of awe, that something forbidden had awakened beneath the weight of fear. When night returned, they rested in a clearing beside the river. The water glimmered under the faint light of a half-moon, reflecting a world that felt briefly untouched by law or sin. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to explain. The road ahead led south, but neither of them believed in destinations anymore. The journey itself had become the only truth left to them, a fragile defiance, carried on the sound of hoofbeats and the breath of the river that refused to sleep. The third night on the river road was colder than the others. The wind carried the smell of rain and swamp water, and the moonlight broke through the trees in uneven patches, pale and uncertain. Benjamin and Isabel had traveled in silence for hours, the sound of the horses' hooves muffled by mud. The further they moved from Cypress Hollow, the closer the air felt, as though the very world were holding its breath. Freedom had a sound. Benjamin thought a sound like the heartbeat you could hear when everything else went still. But freedom also had a price, and by dawn, they would learn it. The river split near Iberville, widening into a slow brown expanse where the current moved like thought, steady, deceptive, always pulling toward the sea. At the crossing stood a small ferry house, little more than a shack built of warped boards and faded paint. The man who owned it was old, with a beard like Spanish moss and eyes too calm for a place that saw fugitives more often than it saw travelers. He asked no questions, only nodded when Benjamin handed him coins, his voice slow as syrup when he promised to take them across before sunrise. It seemed simple enough, but in the stillness of waiting, the air began to change. The man's gaze lingered too long. His silence grew too deliberate. Somewhere beyond the trees, a dog barked once, sharp and distant. The betrayal came before the river crossing. Lanterns flickered on the far bank, more than a dozen. Men's voices carried across the water, low but unmistakable. Patrol riders, bounty hunters. Benjamin saw the ferryman's eyes shift toward the sound, saw the faint glimmer of silver in his pocket, the coin already earned. There was no time to run. The men came fast, their boots splashing through the shallows, the light of their torches dancing against the black water. Isabel was seized first, dragged from the horse by her arm, her cry lost in the thunder of approaching hooves. Benjamin turned, and something inside him hardened. He did not run. He charged. The first man to reach him fell beneath a single blow, the crack of bone echoing louder than the wind. Another swung a rifle butt that Benjamin caught with his forearm, snapping it in half before the third man struck him across the back. He fought with nothing but his hands, his strength born not of anger but of refusal. 3 men went down before the rest surrounded him. The torches blurred in his vision as the strikes came from every side, but still he did not yield. It took 6 men to bring him to the ground. When they finally pinned him, his face was bloodied, his breath shallow, yet his eyes burned with something none of them could name. By morning, the story had already begun to travel. A runaway slave had fought a dozen armed men and nearly broken through them. Some said he had killed 2. Some said the colonel's daughter had begged them to stop. Others swore he rose to his knees after the final blow, refusing to stay down. The truth mattered less than the power of the telling. By sundown, the ferryman who had betrayed them was gone, vanished into the swamps with his silver. But the tale of Benjamin spread faster than any rumor before it. In the quarters along the river, they whispered his name like prayer. The man who would not kneel, who fought with his bare hands against the world that tried to own him. His body was broken, but his defiance had become something else entirely, a story that no chain, no whip, no river could drown. The morning of the punishment dawned with an unnatural clarity, the kind of light that exposes everything instead of blessing it. The storm clouds of previous days had cleared, leaving the sky a hard, merciless blue. From every road and parish around Cypress Hollow, people came, planters, merchants, overseers, wives in bonnets, and boys eager for spectacle. They gathered before the courthouse steps, whispering about the slave who had fought a dozen men with his bare hands, and the daughter who had vanished with him. The story had grown like wildfire through the bayous, tangled with rumor and moral outrage. Now the crowd waited for the conclusion, the law's performance of order. Colonel Bartholomew Creighton arrived later than expected, his carriage rolling through the dust like a hearse. He wore black, though no funeral had been declared. His gloves hid the tremor that had become his shame, yet nothing could hide the hollow look in his eyes. He had demanded the event take place in public, to restore the hierarchy, the river, the fire, and his own weakness had undone. But beneath the surface of his anger lay something closer to desperation. He needed the world to see him as master again, even if his body refused to obey. Benjamin stood at the center of the courtyard, wrists bound but posture unbroken. The marks of his last fight were still visible cuts, healing unevenly, a bruise shadowing his jaw, but his gaze was steady. The murmur of the crowd softened when he was led forward. There was something in his calm that unsettled them, a quiet refusal that made every onlooker aware of their own fear. When the whip cracked through the air, the sound split the square in two. The overseer raised his arm again, but the rhythm faltered. The colonel had insisted on delivering the final lashes himself. His gloved hand gripped the handle, the leather coiled like a serpent ready to strike. For a moment, time seemed to collapse the courthouse, the crowd, the river, all dissolving into a single heartbeat. Then Benjamin lifted his head and met the colonel's gaze. It was not defiance in his eyes, it was recognition. The same look he had given in the fire, in the flood, in every moment when Creighton had tried to break him. A look that said, without a word, that power built on fear cannot last forever. The colonel's hand began to shake. The whip slipped, striking the ground with a dull, useless sound. His other hand joined the tremor, his breath catching as murmurs rippled through the crowd. He tried to lift his arm again but could not. The shaking spread until the whip fell completely from his grasp. No one moved. The silence that followed was thicker than the Louisiana heat. For the first time in his life, Bartholomew Creighton's authority failed him in front of witnesses. His body betrayed what his mind refused to accept, that he no longer ruled anything, not even himself. Benjamin did not smile, did not speak. He simply stood as the guards hesitated, waiting for the next order that would never come. The crowd began to disperse in uneasy quiet, the legend of the man who would not kneel already taking shape in whispers. By nightfall, people across the parish would speak of what they had seen: the whip that could not rise, the master who trembled before his slave, and the silence that felt like judgment from something older than law. The courthouse square, still vibrating from the silence that followed the colonel's collapse, seemed to hold its breath. The crowd that had come to witness punishment now stood suspended between disbelief and unease. The whip lay abandoned on the dirt, the master trembling before the man he had once owned. Whispers flickered through the people like sparks through dry grass, uncertain yet unstoppable. It was into that silence that Isabel Creighton stepped forward. She had arrived unnoticed, cloaked and mud-streaked from travel, her face pale but her eyes lit with something fierce and unrelenting. The townsfolk turned as she mounted the steps, the daughter of the house they had always spoken of in hushed tones. To them, she was supposed to be a figure of refinement, a woman shaped by etiquette and inheritance. Yet there was nothing delicate in the voice that broke through the heavy air. She began not with accusation but with truth. Her words fell measured and clear, carrying farther than the colonel's own authority ever had. She spoke of what Cypress Hollow had become: a monument to cruelty mistaken for order, a house built on the bones of those who labored beneath it. Then her voice changed, sharper, cutting through the murmurs. She said her father had chained everything he touched: the land, the people, and even the God he prayed to had been shackled by his greed. The sentence struck like thunder. The colonel, still on his knees, looked up at her with eyes full of disbelief. No one in the parish had ever heard a Creighton woman speak against her blood, against the very foundation of their name. Isabel's defiance turned that square into a pulpit, and her father's trembling into testimony. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as she went on, naming the sickness that had long been mistaken for tradition. She spoke of Benjamin's courage, of a dignity that no law could contain. She called it what it was: not rebellion, but justice refusing to stay buried. A few in the crowd began to avert their eyes, others crossed themselves, but the younger men and women listened differently. Something old and buried stirred in them, something that did not belong to fear. In that moment, her words did what the flood, the fire, and the whip had failed to do. They cracked the illusion of permanence that kept Cypress Hollow standing. When Isabel finished, no one cheered. The silence that followed was more powerful than noise. The colonel tried to speak, but his voice came out thin, strangled by the weight of what had just been said. His hand still trembled, gloved and helpless, the symbol of a man who had lost even the right to his own name. That evening, word of Isabel's speech traveled faster than the setting sun. By nightfall, every house from the river to the courthouse had heard of the daughter who had defied her father before the whole parish. The enslaved whispered her name with awe, and the masters spoke it with unease. The seed of her words had been planted deep, and though none yet knew it, that morning would be remembered as the day the Creighton order began to die. For the first time in the memory of Cypress Hollow, fear no longer belonged entirely to the powerless. The decay of Cypress Hollow did not come all at once. It arrived quietly, settling first in the corners of the great house, then spreading outward like a slow infection. The walls, once gleaming with whitewash, began to darken with damp. The veranda boards warped beneath the humidity, and the roof tiles rattled loose each night when the wind passed over the river. The sugarcane that had once stood in proud green rows now grew patchy and stunted, as if the soil itself had lost the will to nourish what belonged to the Creightons. Workers began to vanish without a trace. Some left in the night, crossing the river toward rumors of free soil. Others simply stopped showing up in the fields. The overseers searched the cane and the woods beyond, but found no sign of struggle. Only empty cabins, cold fires, and footprints leading south. The stories spread quickly, whole families disappearing like smoke, no dogs barking, no shots fired. To the remaining workers, it felt like deliverance. To the colonel, it felt like betrayal. The sugar house burned next. It began with the faintest orange flicker in the rafters and ended in a pillar of fire so high it turned the night sky red. The flames consumed everything, the vats, the mills, the barrels stacked for transport. The air filled with the smell of molasses and ruin. The workers watched from the distance, silent, while the overseers shouted orders no one obeyed. When the roof collapsed, the sparks drifted upward like stars breaking free. By morning, nothing remained but blackened iron and the ghosts of years gone wrong. Colonel Bartholomew Creighton sat at the long dining table, while the smoke still hung over the fields. The once grand hall was empty now, its portraits crooked, its silver tarnished. He stared at the candle burning at the table's center, the flame trembling in rhythm with his hand. The pistol rested beside him, gleaming faintly in the dim light. He had cleaned it twice that morning, not from duty but from habit. It was the only thing left in his possession that responded to command. He poured himself another glass of bourbon, though half of it spilled before it reached his lips. The tremor had grown worse, spreading from his hand to his shoulder. The liquid dripped down his wrist, dark as blood in the candlelight. Outside, the plantation was silent. No bells, no hammers, no voices. Only the creaking of the old house, settling under its own weight. The colonel thought about the faces that had once filled this table. His wife, long gone. His daughter, vanished into the same wildness that had swallowed the man who defied him. Every name he had ever spoken in authority had turned against him. The river had taken his overseer, the flood had taken his crops, and time had taken his fear. Now, all that remained was the sound of his own unsteady breath. He reached for the pistol once, then again, but his hand refused him. The tremor made it dance against the table. A cruel mockery of control. For a moment he imagined what it would feel like to end the noise inside his head, to silence the laughter that haunted his dreams. But when the moment came, courage failed him. As the candle guttered and the last of the bourbon spilled, Bartholomew Creighton sat alone in the house that bore his name, surrounded by the weight of what he had built and what it had cost. The empire of Cypress Hollow had rotted from within, its master consumed not by enemies, but by the decay of his own making. Outside, the wind carried the scent of smoke and river water, the final breath of a world already dead. The fog came in thick before dawn, rolling off the river like breath from something alive. It crept through the cane fields and swallowed the road, muffling every sound except the steady creak of wagon wheels and the iron clink of chains. The jail wagon moved slowly toward the courthouse, carrying what was left of Benjamin. His wrists were bound, his body bruised, his breath shallow. But his eyes were awake, watching the pale world beyond the bars with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for the right moment to breathe. The guards spoke little. The fog unnerved them, and for good reason. Cypress Hollow had grown restless since the day of the whipping that never finished. Whispers of revolt moved like wildfire through the bayous. It was said that the river spirits had chosen their own weapon, that the man who would not kneel had become something death itself refused to claim. Even those who laughed at such talk did not laugh at the fog. It felt thick enough to hide anything, a prayer, a bullet, a ghost. Halfway down the parish road, the first shadow moved through the mist, then another. The sound came softly at first, the wet slap of bare feet against mud, followed by the whistle of a reed flute, low, mournful, ancient. The guards froze. Before they could raise their rifles, the fog erupted in motion. Freedmen, their faces smeared with river clay, stepped from the trees like phantoms. The fight lasted seconds. A lantern shattered, a horse screamed, and the wagon tipped sideways into the ditch. When the noise cleared, the guards were gone, swallowed by the swamp. Benjamin stood in the wreckage, his chains broken, the fog curling around him like smoke from a vanished fire. The men who freed him said nothing. They only nodded once and melted back into the trees. The river was waiting, and so was she. Isabel had been waiting near the crossing since midnight, her horse tied beneath the cypress roots, her clothes plain and stained with ash. Disguised as a washerwoman, she looked nothing like the daughter of a plantation. When Benjamin appeared through the fog, their eyes met, but no words passed between them. They both knew there was no time for speeches. The sound of hooves echoed faintly in the distance. Soldiers. They reached the bayou just as the first light broke through the mist. The water gleamed silver, calm but deceptive, its stillness hiding the slow pull of current beneath. They pushed the small ferry into the water, the boards creaking under their weight, and began to cross. Each stroke of the oar felt like a heartbeat stolen from the world behind them. But halfway across, Isabel stopped. On the far bank, figures stood waiting, men in gray coats, rifles glinting in the newborn light. The fog began to thin, revealing faces cold and unblinking. The soldiers said nothing. They did not need to. The river had delivered its fugitives straight into their hands. The silence that followed was worse than gunfire. Isabel's hand tightened on the ferry rope, Benjamin's breath slow and steady beside her. The river's current tugged at them both, as if urging them to choose return to the shore behind them or trust the depths below. The mist lifted completely then, and the moment froze between heartbeat and history. On one side of the river lay captivity, on the other the thin promise of freedom guarded by men with rifles. Beneath them, the dark water moved, ancient and waiting. The world held still, and fate leaned in to listen. The dawn came gray and swollen with mist, the kind of morning where the light itself seemed to bleed slowly into the world. The fog clung to the bayou like gauze, muffling the sounds of birds, muting the rush of water. Isabel and Benjamin stood near the crossing, the small ferry creaking beneath their weight, when a sound broke through the silence, the slow grind of hooves on gravel. The fog parted, and out of it came Colonel Bartholomew Creighton. He looked older than the last time either of them had seen him, a man half carved from the ghost of what he used to be. His clothes were immaculate, but his eyes were hollow, sunken by nights without sleep. The trembling in his right hand had grown worse. The glove did little to hide it now. In his other hand, he carried a pistol, the same one that had rested on his dining table through so many sleepless nights. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and sound but broken beneath the surface. The soldiers who had been waiting along the far bank drew back, uncertain whether to intervene. This was not law anymore. This was something older, something personal. The colonel dismounted with effort, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. For a long moment, he stood without speaking, the fog curling around all three of them like a shroud. Then he raised the pistol. The hand that had once commanded the labor of 100 men now shook so violently that the barrel wavered like a reed in the wind. He tried to speak, perhaps a curse, perhaps a plea, but no words came. Benjamin did not move. His face was calm, his shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on the man who had once owned him. It was not defiance that held him still, but pity. The tremor in Creighton's arm grew worse. The gun fired. The sound shattered the morning, echoing across the river. The bullet missed, splintering wood and vanishing into the fog. The colonel staggered as though struck himself, the pistol slipping from his grasp. Isabel moved before thought, stepping between them, her skirts brushing the damp earth. The soldiers froze. No one dared move. She reached for the gun, but it was already falling. It struck a rock, spun once, and slid down the embankment into the water. The splash was soft, almost tender, and then it was gone, swallowed by the river's slow current. The sound lingered, though, as if the earth itself had exhaled. The colonel stared at the spot where it disappeared, his hand still twitching in the air, the tremor now useless without purpose. The pistol was gone, and with it, the last symbol of his power. The silence that followed was not peace but revelation. Creighton sank to his knees, not out of surrender but exhaustion. The weight of years, the cruelty, the fear, the inheritance of blood crushed him at last. Isabel stood above him, her breath steady, her eyes fixed on the water that had claimed his weapon. On the far bank, the soldiers began to lower their rifles, uncertain who among them was master now. The fog began to lift as the sun pushed through, pale gold spreading across the surface of the bayou. The river carried the pistol away, glinting once before disappearing into the depths. In that moment, the spell that had held Cypress Hollow for generations broke. Power, once hoarded through violence and silence, dissolved into the current. The master had missed his mark, and the river had taken what he could no longer hold. Time softened the memory of what happened at Cypress Hollow, but it never erased it. The plantation itself vanished first. The sugar fields turned wild, the big house sank into the earth, and the chimneys that once smoked with industry stood like gravestones against the sky. The river changed its course by inches each year, swallowing what remained of the road, the fences, and finally the stone pillars that once marked the entrance. By the time another generation came to walk the land, only stories were left, passed in whispers from porch to porch, fire to fire. The old folks called it a cursed place, though not with fear in their voices. The curse was not one of ghosts but of memory, a haunting that reminded the living of the man who had stood unbroken when everything around him fell. They said his name was Benjamin, but few could agree on the details. Some told of a giant with arms like oak branches, who laughed in the face of the whip and made his master's hand shake from that day forward. Others claimed he escaped west, crossed into Texas, and bought his own freedom with money earned cutting timber and hauling freight. There were those who swore he sailed down the Mississippi and vanished into the Gulf, leaving behind nothing but the echo of his laughter in the reeds. What everyone agreed upon was the ending. The master died alone in his decaying house, a pistol rusting somewhere at the bottom of the bayou. His name faded from ledgers, his estate swallowed by debt and water. Isabel's name lived longer. Some said she went north and taught reading to freed children. Others believed she lived quietly by the river, tending a small garden where the sugarcane once grew, waiting for someone who never returned. And as for Benjamin, he became more than a man. He became a story. The tale of the fat slave who made his master tremble spread far beyond the parish lines, carried by travelers and preachers, whispered by field hands in Georgia, by dock workers in New Orleans, by soldiers on both sides of the war that followed. Each telling changed him slightly. Some made him a preacher, some a rebel, some a ghost who still walked the water's edge at night. But the core of him remained the same. A man who refused to kneel, whose laughter outlasted fear. Children grew up hearing that when the wind passed through the reeds at Cypress Hollow, it sounded like someone laughing, a deep, low rolling sound that rose and fell with the rhythm of the river. The elders said it was Benjamin, still laughing at the masters, who thought they could own the earth, still laughing at the laws that tried to cage a soul. They said the river carried that laugh from parish to parish, from age to age, reminding every listener that some spirits do not bow, even when history demands they do. Long after the cane rotted away and the river changed its name, that sound remained. Travelers would stop along the road and swear they heard it in the wind, soft at first, then stronger, as if the land itself was remembering. It was not a cry of vengeance, nor a song of sorrow. It was something older, something purer, a laugh that had once shaken a veranda, silenced a whip, and brought a kingdom of cruelty to its knees. And in that sound, the story of Cypress Hollow lived on, eternal as the river, endless as freedom itself.